Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. The doorbell didn't chime its usual greeting. My fingers brushed against the familiar brass button, but it remained mute, refusing its small song. As I stepped inside, the floorboards beneath my feet felt unusually solid, no subtle groan accompanying my weight. The air held a weight, thick and expectant, though void of the usual sense of home. I reached for the light switch. The room stayed inert, shadows holding their ground. My fingertips hovered above the once reliable surface of the old table, the softness unexpectedly smooth, as if pretending comfort. I paused, hands suspended, as if caught between the tactile memory and the present doubt, questioning which version held the truth. Sleep comes in fragments now. Each night I wake to the sound of something electrical humming just beyond the walls. The frequency sits low in my chest, vibrating through my ribs like a second heartbeat. When I press my ear to the plaster, the sound stops. The silence that follows feels heavier than the noise itself. My skin has been tingling for weeks, not the sharp prick of pins and needles, but something softer, more persistent. Like invisible fingers trailing across my arms in patterns I can't quite decode. The sensation follows me through daylight hours, settling into my palms when I hold coffee cups, spreading up my spine when I sit in certain chairs. There were lights behind the trees. The memory surfaces without warning, always the same fragment. I'm standing at a window that might be mine, watching something move between branches that sway without wind. The light isn't white or yellow or any color I can name. It pulses with the rhythm of that humming sound, though I can't remember hearing both at the same time. My reflection in mirrors has been acting strange, not the image itself, but the timing. I raise my hand and watch the glass version follow a half-second too late, as if it's thinking about whether to obey. The delay is so brief I almost convince myself it's imagination, but my eyes keep catching it, that tiny hesitation that makes my stomach drop. The brass button feels different each time I touch it, sometimes warm, sometimes cold enough to make my fingertip recoil. The doorbell worked fine before, I'm certain of this, though I can't recall the last time I heard its chime. The silence where sound should be creates a hollow space in my chest, an absence that seems to expand with each failed attempt. I don't remember ever coming back. This thought arrives fully formed, carrying weight I can't explain. Coming back from where? The words feel important, urgent, but when I try to follow them deeper, they dissolve like sugar in water. My mind slides away from the question, finding safer ground in the texture of bed sheets or the temperature of morning air. The floorboards remember something I don't. When I walk the same path through the house, they respond differently each time. Sometimes they sing their familiar wooden songs, sometimes they remain silent as stone. The inconsistency makes me question my own weight, wonder if I'm becoming lighter or if the house is becoming more solid, more real than I am. Objects breathe when I'm not looking directly at them. The old table expands and contracts in my peripheral vision, its surface rising and falling like a sleeping chest. When I turn to watch it fully, it freezes into ordinary furniture, but I can feel its aliveness waiting just outside my direct attention. The noise didn't come from outside. This realization arrives with the taste of copper on my tongue. The humming, the electrical frequency that wakes me each night, originates somewhere inside my own walls, or perhaps inside something else entirely. I've walked every room, pressed my ear to every surface, but the source remains elusive, always one wall away from discovery. Time moves strangely in the hours before dawn. I'll be lying in bed, counting the pulse of that invisible hum, and suddenly the room fills with light that doesn't come from any window. Not sunlight, not lamplight, but something that makes the air itself glow with a warmth that doesn't touch my skin. During these moments, my body feels distant, as if I'm observing it from somewhere above or beside or through. The tingling in my palms intensifies when I touch certain surfaces. The smooth table that pretends comfort sends waves up my arms, each pulse carrying information I can't translate. My fingertips seem to be reading something written in a language of sensation, decoding messages that my conscious mind refuses to process. There's a door I keep finding half open. Not any door I remember opening, not in any room I recognize completely. It stands ajar just wide enough to suggest invitation, but when I approach, the space beyond appears darker than darkness should be. The air that flows through the gap carries that sharp, metallic scent that makes my nostrils burn and my eyes water. The shadows in my house have developed preferences. They gather in corners that used to remain evenly lit, pooling like liquid darkness that doesn't respond to additional light sources. When I flip switches or light candles, the shadows simply relocate, maintaining their chosen density regardless of my attempts to dispel them. My reflection arrives before I do now. I'll approach a mirror and find my image already waiting, already positioned as if it knew I was coming. The face looking back carries an expression I don't remember making, eyes slightly wider than they should be, mouth holding secrets I haven't learned to keep. The electrical humming has begun to harmonize with itself. What started as a single frequency now layers into complex chords that resonate in my bones. The music, if it can be called music, seems to be building towards something, adding new tones each night like an orchestra tuning for a performance I'm not sure I want to attend. I keep finding myself in rooms I don't remember entering. The transition feels seamless, as if I'm editing my own experience, cutting from one location to another without the journey between. My body carries the memory of movement, muscles slightly tired as if I've been walking, but my mind holds no record of the steps taken. The air tastes of ozone now, sharp and clean in a way that makes my tongue feel numb. The flavor intensifies near that half-open door, near the windows where lights move behind swaying trees, near the surfaces that send tingling messages through my fingertips. It's the taste of before storms, of electricity gathering strength. There were voices in the spaces between sounds, not words I could understand, but tones that carried meaning directly into my chest, bypassing my ears entirely. They spoke in the gaps between the humming frequencies, in the silence that followed the doorbell's refusal to chime, in the pause before my reflection caught up with my movements. The house breathes with me now, or perhaps I've learned to breathe with it. Our rhythms have synchronized into something larger than either of us alone. When I inhale, the walls seem to expand slightly. When I exhale, they settle back into themselves. We've become parts of the same organism, sharing the same electrical pulse, the same frequency of existence. My skin remembers being touched by something that left no visible trace. The tingling patterns form maps across my arms, my back, my face, charting territories I've never visited but somehow recognize. The invisible contact feels familiar, as if my body has been having conversations my mind wasn't invited to join. The lights behind the trees have begun to respond to my attention. When I stand at the window and focus on their movement, they pulse brighter, as if acknowledging my observation. The communication feels ancient, wordless, conducted through fluctuations of brightness that my eyes understand but my brain cannot process. Time stops in the space between the humming and the silence. In those suspended moments, I can feel myself existing in multiple places simultaneously, my consciousness stretched across rooms I've never seen but somehow know intimately. The sensation should be frightening, but instead it feels like remembering something I've always known. The brass button has begun to warm under my touch, responding to my presence with heat that spreads up my finger like slow fire. The warmth carries information, pulses of meaning that my skin absorbs and translates into something my mind refuses to acknowledge. The doorbell remains silent, but the button itself has become a different kind of communication device. I don't remember sleeping, but I wake with the taste of metal and the sound of harmonized frequencies still vibrating in my chest. The transition from unconsciousness feels incomplete, as if part of me never quite returned from wherever it went during the dark hours. My body carries the exhaustion of travel, though I never left the house. The shadows have begun to move independently of their light sources. They flow like water across walls and floors, gathering in patterns that suggest purpose, intelligence, intention. When I try to photograph them, the images show only ordinary darkness, but my eyes continue to see the flowing, the gathering, the purposeful arrangement of absence. My reflection has started to mouth words I'm not speaking. The lips in the mirror form shapes that carry meaning I almost recognize, conducting a conversation I can only observe from one side. Sometimes I find myself trying to lip-read my own image, searching for messages I'm apparently sending to myself. The door stands wider now, the darkness beyond it less complete. Shapes move in that space, familiar forms that might be furniture or might be something else entirely. The metallic scent has grown stronger, more complex, carrying undertones that remind me of rain and electricity and something else I can't name. The humming has found its way into my dreams, or perhaps my dreams have found their way into the humming. The boundary between sleeping and waking has become negotiable, a membrane I can pass through without noticing the transition. Consciousness flows like water finding its level, settling into whatever container will hold it. There were lights behind the trees, and now I remember standing among them, not watching from the window, but present in that space between branches, surrounded by that nameless illumination that made the air itself glow. The memory surfaces in fragments, each piece carrying the weight of truth and the impossibility of experience. My fingertips have memorized textures that don't exist in daylight, surfaces that feel like glass and metal and something organic all at once, temperatures that shift under my touch, patterns that my skin can read but my eyes cannot see. The invisible geography of these sensations maps a world that occupies the same space as my familiar rooms. The doorbell didn't chime its usual greeting, and now I understand why. The sound it was meant to make exists in a frequency I can no longer hear with my ears alone. My whole body has become the listening device, receiving signals through skin and bone and blood, translating vibrations into meanings that bypass language entirely. As I step inside, the floorboards beneath my feet feel unusually solid, no subtle groan accompanying my weight, but now I realize they're supporting more than just my physical form. Something else moves through this space, something that requires the floors to be stronger, the air to be thicker, the light to behave differently than light should behave. My fingers brush against the familiar brass button, and it responds with warmth that spreads through my entire hand, up my arm into my chest where it harmonizes with the electrical humming that has become the soundtrack of my existence. The doorbell remains silent, but silence itself has become a form of communication I'm finally learning to understand. Story 2. I had just smoothed the last crease in the curtain. The fabric brushed against my palm, a soothing ritual that usually signaled the end of the day. Yet tonight the texture seemed different, less familiar. A hum lingered in the room, barely audible, like the memory of a breath against skin. I glanced around, every surface intact, but my fingertips tingled with unease. The air carried a weight that wasn't there before. My chest tightened, sensing an imbalance in the ordinary, as if something trivial had shifted. The room seemed the same, but clarity evaded me. Something in the quiet had changed its tune. That was 3 weeks ago. The curtain still hangs there, but I haven't touched it since. I can't bring myself to go near that window after dark. The fabric moves sometimes, even when there's no breeze, swaying with a rhythm that doesn't match anything natural. I watch it from across the room, my back pressed against the opposite wall, counting the gentle oscillations until my eyes burn from staring. The sleep never comes anymore, not real sleep. I drift into something that feels like drowning in warm water, only to jolt awake with the taste of copper coating my tongue. The digital clock beside my bed flickers between numbers that don't exist, displaying symbols that hurt to look at directly. When I blink, it shows normal time again, but my skin feels electrified, as if I've been touched by something that conducts more than just current. My neighbors have stopped making eye contact. They hurry past my door with their heads down, clutching their children closer when they see me in the hallway. I understand why. The fluorescent lights above me stutter and dim whenever I walk beneath them. The elevator buttons stick under my touch, requiring multiple presses before they respond. Even my reflection in the mailbox glass appears slightly delayed, like an echo of movement rather than movement itself. The doctors say it's stress, anxiety manifesting in unusual ways. They prescribed pills that rattle in their orange container, but I haven't taken any. The sound they make when I shake the bottle reminds me of something else, something that rattles in the walls late at night when the building should be silent. A percussion that starts soft and grows insistent, moving through the pipes and wiring like a message being transmitted in a language I almost recognize. I've been documenting the disturbances, not with cameras or recording devices. Those stopped working properly after the first week. The batteries drain within hours, and the footage always comes out distorted, filled with interference patterns that spiral across the screen like oil on water. Instead, I write everything down by hand, using a pencil because pens seem to skip across the paper, leaving gaps in sentences that I don't remember creating. The maintenance crew won't come to my unit anymore. They claim there's nothing wrong with the electrical system, but I've seen them testing the outlets in the hallway outside my door, their meters producing readings that make them shake their heads and mutter to each other in voices too low for me to understand. The building superintendent avoids my calls now. When I catch him in person, he looks through me as if I'm not entirely there, his eyes focusing on a point just beyond my shoulder. The temperature in my apartment fluctuates without pattern. I'll be sitting in what feels like a comfortable room, and suddenly my breath becomes visible, small puffs of vapor that dissipate too slowly in air that should be warm. Other times, the heat builds until sweat beads on my forehead, but the thermostat reads the same temperature it always has. The metal fixtures become too hot to touch. Then ice cold minutes later, cycling between extremes that leave condensation patterns on surfaces that form shapes I try not to interpret. Water doesn't taste right anymore, not just in my apartment, but anywhere I go. It carries a metallic undertone that lingers long after I've finished drinking, coating the inside of my mouth with a sensation that reminds me of holding coins under my tongue. Even bottled water from sealed containers has this quality, as if something in my perception has fundamentally altered, filtering every sensation through a lens I can't remove. I remember now what happened before the sleeplessness began, before the lights started their irregular dance. I was standing in my kitchen, washing dishes in the sink when the water stopped flowing. Not gradually, not with the sputtering of old pipes, but instantly, as if someone had severed the connection with surgical precision. I turned the handle back and forth, listening to the hollow clicking of the mechanism, when I noticed the silence. Complete silence, no traffic from the street below, no footsteps from the apartment above, no distant murmur of televisions or conversations bleeding through thin walls. The city had vanished around me, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the faint electrical hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. I stood there, my hands still wet with dish soap, feeling the weight of that impossible quiet pressing against my eardrums. The silence lasted exactly long enough for me to notice it, to feel the wrongness of it settling into my bones. Then everything resumed at once, a sudden rush of normal sounds flooding back as if someone had unmuted the world. The water began flowing again, but it came out in a color that wasn't quite clear, with tiny particles suspended in the stream that caught the light like microscopic mirrors. I turned off the faucet and stepped back from the sink, my wet hands leaving prints on the counter that evaporated faster than they should have. That's when I saw it through the kitchen window, just for a moment, just long enough to register its presence before my mind tried to reject what I was seeing. Something was hovering above the building across the street. Not a helicopter or a drone, nothing with rotors or wings or any visible means of staying aloft. It was perfectly still, a dark shape against the evening sky that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I couldn't determine its size or distance, as if my eyes refused to focus on it properly, sliding away whenever I tried to examine its edges. I blinked and it was gone, not moved away or departed, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. But the afterimage remained burned into my vision, a shadow that followed my gaze no matter where I looked. I rubbed my eyes until they watered, but the shape persisted, growing fainter but never completely disappearing. The next morning I convinced myself it had been a trick of light, a cloud formation or optical illusion brought on by fatigue. I went about my routine normally, making coffee and checking the news, but the taste was wrong and the words on the screen seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Small things, easily dismissed, but they accumulated throughout the day like sediment settling in still water. Going back further, I can trace the beginning to subtle changes I hadn't connected at the time. The elevator in my building had started making a different sound, a low harmonic that resonated in my chest when I rode it. Other passengers didn't seem to notice, continuing their conversations or staring at their phones, but I felt it in my ribcage, a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly around the edges. The building's ventilation system had changed too. Air moved through the ducts with irregular patterns, sometimes rushing with urgent force, other times barely circulating at all. I would lie in bed listening to the ebb and flow, trying to find a rhythm, but it followed no natural cycle. The air itself felt different when it emerged from the vents, carrying scents that didn't belong to any season or location I could identify. My reflection in mirrors had begun arriving a fraction of a second late, not noticeably at first, just a subtle disconnect between my movements and their appearance in glass surfaces. I would turn my head and my reflection would complete the motion just slightly after I had finished. When I tested it deliberately, moving my hand back and forth in front of the bathroom mirror, the delay became more pronounced, as if the image was traveling a greater distance to reach the surface. Electronics in my vicinity started displaying minor malfunctions. My phone would receive calls from numbers that didn't exist, strings of digits too long or too short, producing only silence when I answered. The microwave would activate for a few seconds without being programmed, its turntable spinning empty while the interior light flickered in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. The television would change channels on its own, always to static-filled stations that weren't part of any broadcast schedule. The first truly undeniable sign occurred during what should have been an ordinary evening. I was reading in my living room when the pages of my book began turning themselves, not from any breeze or vibration, but with deliberate, measured movements, as if invisible fingers were carefully flipping through the chapters. I sat perfectly still, watching the paper move with its own volition, until the book reached its final page and lay open, waiting. The room around me had shifted during this display, though I couldn't identify exactly how. Shadows fell at wrong angles despite the unchanged position of lamps. The walls seemed both closer and farther away, as if space itself had become unreliable. When I stood up, my footsteps echoed with a hollow quality that suggested I was walking in a much larger area than my modest apartment could contain. Before any of this began, there was a day that felt perfectly normal. I had returned from work tired but content, looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The sun was setting through my windows, casting familiar patterns of light across the floor. I prepared a simple meal, listened to music, and felt the comfortable weight of routine settling around me like a well-worn blanket. The building was peaceful that evening. Neighbors moved through the hallways with their usual sounds, doors opening and closing with the soft thuds of daily life. Children played in the courtyard below, their laughter drifting up through open windows. Everything was as it should be, unremarkable and safe. I remember standing by the window as darkness fell, watching lights come on in apartments across the street. Each window framed small scenes of ordinary existence, people moving through their evening rituals, unaware that they were being observed. I felt connected to this quiet community, part of a larger organism of shared experience and mutual invisibility. The air that night carried the usual urban mixture of exhaust and cooking food, concrete warming and cooling, the green scent of small gardens tucked between buildings. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the approaching disruption of everything I understood about the nature of my reality. I had smoothed that curtain into place and felt satisfied with the simple completion of the gesture. The fabric hung properly, blocking the view from outside while still allowing me to peek through if I chose. It was a barrier I controlled, a boundary I had established between my private space and the world beyond. I couldn't have known that something was already watching from that world beyond, something that didn't require windows or gaps in curtains to see inside. Something that had been studying the patterns of my life, learning the rhythms of my routine, waiting for the moment when my defenses were lowest and my awareness turned inward. The curtain still moves in the breeze that isn't there, and I know that whatever began watching that night has never looked away. Story 3. It was the hollow tap of footsteps on tile, a rhythm that slipped easily between the cracks in my mind. In the kitchen, where morning light filtered through fibrous curtains, the sound echoed differently, almost mocking. I held my breath and listened again, nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of a wall clock. But the sensation persisted, a prickle against the base of my skull, urging me down the hallway. The floor beneath felt uneven, each step a faint discordant note that shouldn't have been. This was the cadence I knew from somewhere else, a place best left forgotten. Yet the tap refused to fade, pulling me deeper into the unsettling present. I hadn't heard it since that day, and now it was back. The first dream came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. The days had been blending together like watercolors left in rain. I found myself standing in a room I didn't recognize, though the proportions felt familiar. The walls were that peculiar shade of off-white that exists nowhere in nature, the kind you see in institutional buildings or waiting rooms. There was a light above me, not quite circular, more like an oval that had been stretched by invisible hands. It pulsed softly, a rhythm that matched something deep in my chest. In the dream, I could hear a constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the soles of my feet and up into my bones. I tried to move toward what I thought might be a door, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were walking through thick water. The light followed my movements, or perhaps I was following it. The distinction became unclear. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, though the room felt cool. I attributed it to stress. Work had been demanding, and I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks. The dream lingered for a few minutes, then faded like most dreams do, leaving only the vague impression of that oval light and the persistent hum that seemed to echo in my ears even after I'd gotten up and made coffee. But the dream returned. The second time I was in the same room, but it lasted longer. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that made my stomach turn. The oval light was brighter now, casting shadows that moved independently of any visible objects. I could make out more details, a subtle pattern in the floor tiles, like a grid that extended beyond the edges of my vision. The hum was louder, more complex, layered with what sounded almost like voices speaking in frequencies just beyond human comprehension. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. The sensation was gentle but insistent, like floating in warm water while invisible currents pulled me upward. My feet remained planted on the floor, yet I was rising, or the floor was falling away. The perspective shifted without warning, and suddenly I was looking down at myself from near the ceiling, watching my own body stand motionless in that sterile room. There was a voice then, metallic and distant, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, reverberating through the strange architecture of the space. I strained to listen, but the harder I focused, the more the words dissolved into static. The voice had a quality that made my teeth ache, like fingernails on a chalkboard played at a frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my nervous system. When I woke from this second dream, I found myself sitting up in bed, my hand pressed against my throat as if I'd been trying to speak. My voice felt raw, though I couldn't remember making any sound. The taste in my mouth was sharp and artificial, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more sterile. I got up to get water and noticed that my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked somehow unfamiliar, as if the angles of my face had shifted slightly during the night. The dreams were becoming more frequent, more vivid. Each time I spent longer in that room with its breathing walls and pulsing light. I began to notice details that shouldn't have been possible in a dream. The texture of the floor tiles was consistent every time, each tiny imperfection in the same place. The pattern of shadows cast by the oval light never varied. The metallic voice always spoke the same indecipherable words in the same order. It was during the day, in my actual waking life, that I first noticed the traces. I was making breakfast when I saw it, a small mark on my kitchen counter that I'd never noticed before. It was circular, about the size of a quarter, and it looked like it had been burned into the surface. The mark was perfectly round, with a slight depression in the center that made it look almost like a fingerprint left by something very hot. I ran my finger over it, and the texture felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Later that afternoon, I found myself humming without realizing it. The tune was simple, repetitive, and when I tried to place where I'd heard it, I realized it matched the frequency from my dreams. The hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I stopped humming immediately, but the melody continued to play in the back of my mind like a song stuck on repeat. My electronics began acting strangely. The television would change channels on its own, always stopping on static. My phone would light up with no notifications, the screen displaying nothing but a faint pattern of lines that looked suspiciously like the grid I'd seen on the floor of the dream room. The interference was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or aging equipment, but it was persistent, and it always seemed to happen when I was thinking about the dreams. The third dream was different, more vivid than reality itself. I was in the room again, but this time I could feel the temperature, smell the artificial cleanliness of the air, taste the metallic tang that seemed to coat everything. The oval light above me was so bright it should have hurt my eyes, but instead it felt warm and welcoming, like sunlight through a window. The walls weren't just breathing now, they were moving, shifting their positions with fluid grace. What had seemed like a simple rectangular room was revealing itself to be something much more complex, with angles that didn't quite make sense and corners that seemed to fold in on themselves. Time moved strangely in this dream. I would take a step forward and find myself back where I started. I would reach for what looked like a door handle and discover my hand was already touching it, had been touching it for what felt like hours. The metallic voice was clearer now, speaking in a language that wasn't quite human, but that I somehow understood on a level deeper than words. It was telling me something important, something I needed to remember, but every time I tried to focus on the meaning, it slipped away like water through my fingers. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by something more fundamental, as if my very existence was being observed and catalogued by an intelligence that operated on principles I couldn't comprehend. The sensation wasn't threatening exactly, but it was overwhelming. I tried to wake up, employing all the usual techniques, pinching myself, trying to move my real body, attempting to open my eyes. Nothing worked. I was trapped in the dream, or the dream was trapped in me. When I finally did wake, it was with the unsettling realization that I couldn't be sure how much time had passed. The light outside my window suggested it was still night, but it felt like I'd been asleep for days. My body ached as if I'd been lying in one position for far too long, and there was a soreness in my muscles that suggested physical exertion I couldn't remember. The contamination began slowly, seeping into my waking hours like water through a crack in a dam. I would be sitting at my desk working on mundane tasks when I would hear the hum, faint at first, barely noticeable, but unmistakably the same frequency from my dreams. I would look around, trying to locate the source, but my colleagues showed no signs of hearing anything unusual. The sound would fade after a few minutes, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. The oval light appeared in my peripheral vision during conversations, hanging just at the edge of my sight like an afterimage from a bright flash. When I turned to look directly at it, it was never there, but the impression lingered, a warm spot in my visual field that pulsed gently with its own rhythm. I began losing time, small gaps at first, a few minutes here and there that I couldn't account for. I would be reading a document and suddenly realize I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes without processing a single word. I would start walking to the store and find myself standing in my kitchen with no memory of the journey home, groceries I didn't remember buying sitting on the counter. Sleep became elusive, not because I couldn't fall asleep, but because the boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would close my eyes and immediately find myself in the room with the breathing walls and pulsing light. I would open my eyes and still be there, or think I was there, until some external sound would jar me back to what I hoped was reality. The physical traces became harder to ignore. I found marks on my skin that I couldn't explain, small circular impressions that looked like the burn mark on my kitchen counter. They didn't hurt, but they were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own faint rhythm. I told myself they were probably from sleeping on wrinkled sheets or pressing against something in my sleep, but the marks were too precise, too deliberate in their placement. My reflection continued to look wrong, not dramatically different, just slightly off in ways that were difficult to pinpoint. Sometimes my eyes seemed a different color, or the shape of my nose appeared subtly altered. The changes were never consistent, which made me question whether I was seeing them at all, or if my perception was simply becoming unreliable. The dreams, or what I was still calling dreams, became a nightly occurrence. Each time the room revealed more of itself to me. Hidden passages that led to identical rooms, each with its own oval light and breathing walls. A vast network of connected spaces that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The metallic voice grew more insistent, more urgent, as if it were trying to communicate something crucial before some unspecified deadline. I began to understand, or thought I understood, fragments of what the voice was saying. Instructions, perhaps, or descriptions of processes that were being performed. The language was clinical, detached, but there was an underlying current of something that might have been concern or even compassion. Whatever was happening to me, the voice suggested, was necessary, though the reasons remained opaque. During one particularly vivid episode, I found myself able to move freely through the space. I walked through doorways that led to rooms identical to the first, each one containing the same pulsing oval light, the same breathing walls, the same sense of being observed by an invisible presence. In some rooms I saw other figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing motionless beneath their own lights. They seemed unaware of my presence, or perhaps they were experiencing their own version of what I was going through. The realization crept in gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape you hadn't realized was in darkness. These weren't dreams, they couldn't be dreams. The consistency was too perfect, the details too precise, the physical effects too real. Something was happening to me, something that my conscious mind was interpreting as dreams because that was the only framework it had for understanding experiences that fell outside normal reality. But if they weren't dreams, what were they, and why couldn't I remember them clearly when I was awake? The memories had a slippery quality, like trying to hold on to water. The harder I grasped for them, the more they seemed to slip away, leaving only impressions and sensations that haunted the edges of my consciousness. I began to suspect that something was being hidden from me, or that I was hiding it from myself. The gaps in my memory, the strange marks on my skin, the electronic interference, the physical exhaustion after nights of what should have been restful sleep. All of it pointed to experiences that were being systematically erased or suppressed, filed away in some part of my mind that I couldn't access during normal waking consciousness. The thought was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. If these experiences were real, then I wasn't losing my mind. But if they were real, then something was happening to me that was so far outside my understanding of the world that my brain could only process it as dreams. I started keeping a journal, trying to capture the details before they faded. The act of writing seemed to help anchor the memories, though they still felt fragile and ephemeral. I wrote about the room, the light, the voice, the sensation of being lifted and observed. I wrote about the physical traces, the electronic interference, the lost time. Reading back over my entries, I was struck by how clinical and detached they sounded, as if I were describing someone else's experiences. The journal entries became longer, more detailed, as I found myself able to remember more with each passing day. Or perhaps I was simply becoming better at recognizing the memories as they surfaced. The boundary between dream and reality wasn't disappearing so much as revealing itself to be more porous than I'd ever imagined. I began to notice patterns in my daily life that seemed connected to the experiences. Certain times of day when the hum was more likely to appear. Specific locations where I felt the presence more strongly. Electronic devices that malfunctioned more frequently than others. It was as if my normal life was shot through with threads of something else, a parallel existence that I could only glimpse in fragments. The oval light appeared in my apartment one evening, not as a peripheral vision or an afterimage, but as a clear, unmistakable presence hovering near my ceiling. I stared at it for several minutes, afraid to move or look away. It pulsed with the same gentle rhythm I knew from the dreams, casting no shadows but somehow illuminating the room with a warm, even glow. When I finally blinked, it was gone, but the warmth lingered on my skin for hours afterward. That night the experience was different again. I found myself in the familiar room, but this time I wasn't alone. The metallic voice was coming from a figure that stood just at the edge of my vision, never quite clear enough to make out details but unmistakably present. The figure moved with purpose, manipulating objects or controls that I couldn't see, occasionally turning toward me as if checking on my condition. The sensation of being lifted was stronger than ever, but now I could feel the mechanism behind it, something that supported my body while leaving my consciousness free to observe. The process felt routine, practiced, as if it had been repeated many times before. The figure worked with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, and I had the distinct impression that this was not the first time we had encountered each other. When I woke, or thought I woke, I was lying in my own bed, but something was different. The room felt larger, the ceiling higher than it should have been. The familiar objects around me seemed subtly altered, as if they had been replaced with nearly identical copies that were just slightly off in their proportions. The feeling faded as I became more fully alert, but it left me with a profound sense of displacement, as if I had awakened in a world that was almost, but not quite, the one I remembered. The line between the experiences and my regular life continued to blur. I would be having a normal conversation with a colleague when I would suddenly taste that sharp, ozone-like flavor from the dreams. I would be walking down a familiar street when the sound of my footsteps would change, taking on the hollow quality of steps on the tiles of that impossible room. My reflection in store windows would sometimes show the oval light hovering just above my head, visible for a split second before vanishing when I turned to look directly. The physical changes became more pronounced. The circular marks on my skin multiplied and began forming patterns, geometric arrangements that reminded me of the grid pattern I had seen on the floor of the room. They were still warm to the touch, still pulsed with their own faint rhythm, but now they seemed to be communicating with each other, creating a network of sensation across my body. I started to question everything. Was I really awake right now, or was this another layer of the experience? Were the dreams the reality and my normal life the illusion? The boundaries had become so fluid that I could no longer trust my own perceptions to tell me which state I was in at any given moment. The journal entries from this period are fragmented, inconsistent. Sometimes I wrote about the same event multiple times, with different details each time, as if I were remembering it from different perspectives or at different stages of processing. Other entries seemed to be written in a handwriting that was almost, but not quite, my own, describing experiences I couldn't remember having but that felt intimately familiar. One morning I woke to find a new entry in the journal that I had no memory of writing. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the words described an experience more vivid and detailed than any I had managed to record before. The entry described the room from angles I had never seen, mentioned details about the figure and the equipment that I couldn't consciously recall. Most unsettling of all, it was written in the present tense, as if I had been writing it while the experience was happening. The contamination accelerated. The hum became a constant presence, sometimes so loud I had trouble concentrating, other times so subtle I wondered if I was imagining it. The oval light appeared regularly now in my apartment, at work, on the street. It no longer seemed to be hiding from me, but was instead making its presence known, as if some kind of concealment was no longer necessary. Electronics throughout my life began displaying the same grid pattern I had seen in the room. My computer screen would flicker and show the pattern for a few seconds before returning to normal. My phone's wallpaper would spontaneously change to display the grid, then change back when I wasn't looking directly at it. Even devices I didn't own, televisions in store windows and displays on public kiosks, would briefly show the pattern when I passed by. Time became increasingly unreliable. I would sit down to eat breakfast and suddenly find myself getting ready for bed with no memory of the intervening day. I would start reading a book and finish it without remembering turning any of the pages. Conversations would end before I realized they had begun, leaving me with the impression of having communicated something important but no clear memory of what had been said. The room in my dreams or experiences, or whatever they were, continued to evolve. New areas became accessible, revealing a complex of interconnected spaces that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been physically possible. Some rooms contained equipment that looked almost familiar, like medical devices or scientific instruments, but designed according to principles I couldn't understand. Other rooms were empty except for the ever-present oval lights and the subtle grid patterns on the floors. In one room I found what appeared to be records or documentation, displayed on screens that showed symbols and diagrams that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. The information felt relevant to my situation, but every time I thought I was beginning to understand something, the meaning would slip away, leaving only a sense of frustrated recognition. The figure became more distinct during these later experiences, still not clearly visible, but more interactive, responding to my movements and occasionally seeming to communicate directly with me through means other than the metallic voice. The communication was more like a direct transfer of concepts and sensations than anything resembling language. Through these exchanges, I began to understand that what was happening to me was part of some larger process, though the nature and purpose of that process remained unclear. The most disturbing realization was that the figure seemed to know me, not just as a subject or participant in whatever was taking place, but as an individual. There was a familiarity in its movements around me, a practiced efficiency that suggested a long history of interaction. When it adjusted the equipment or modified the environment of the room, it did so with the kind of automatic precision that comes from intimate knowledge of someone's preferences and needs. Back in what I still thought of as my real life, though I was becoming less certain of the distinction, the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. Friends and colleagues began commenting on my appearance, saying I looked different, though they couldn't specify exactly how. Some said I seemed taller, others thought I had lost weight. A few mentioned that my voice sounded different, though when I asked them to elaborate, they could only say that it seemed to carry differently, as if it were coming from farther away. My apartment felt increasingly unfamiliar. Furniture seemed to be in slightly different positions each morning, though I had no memory of moving anything. The proportions of rooms appeared to shift subtly from day to day, sometimes feeling cramped and claustrophobic, other times seeming too large and echoing. The building itself felt different when I walked through the hallways, as if the architecture had been subtly modified while I slept. The journal had grown thick with entries, many of which I still couldn't remember writing. The handwriting varied from entry to entry, sometimes neat and controlled, other times hurried and barely legible, as if written under stress or in poor lighting conditions. Some entries were written in a technical, clinical style that didn't sound like my normal voice, while others were emotional and confused, full of questions and fragmented observations. Reading through the accumulated entries, I began to see patterns and connections that hadn't been apparent when I was writing individual pieces. The experiences were following a clear progression, building towards something that remained just out of reach of my understanding. The physical changes, the environmental modifications, the increasing frequency and vividness of the experiences, all of it seemed to be leading to some kind of culmination. But even as I recognized the pattern, I felt my ability to perceive it clearly beginning to fade. The memories were becoming more slippery again, the details harder to hold onto. It was as if something was actively working to keep me from seeing the complete picture, allowing me to glimpse fragments but preventing me from assembling them into a coherent whole. The final entry I remember writing clearly was different from all the others. Instead of describing experiences or trying to analyze what was happening to me, I found myself writing instructions, as if I were leaving notes for someone else who would need to navigate the same situation. The instructions were detailed and specific, covering everything from how to recognize the early signs of the experiences to techniques for maintaining awareness during the transitions between states. As I wrote, I had the strange sensation that I was both the author and the intended recipient of these instructions, as if I were somehow communicating with a future or alternate version of myself who would need this information. The feeling was so strong that I found myself addressing the instructions directly to you, as if I were speaking to someone else entirely. That night, I had what I thought would be my last experience in the room with the breathing walls and pulsing oval light. Everything was exactly as it had been in the very first dream, months ago. The same off-white walls, the same stretched oval light, the same constant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I stood in the center of the room, feeling the familiar sensation of being gently lifted while my feet remained planted on the floor. The metallic voice spoke its indecipherable words in the same order it had always used. But there was one difference, one detail that should have been impossible. Lying on the floor beside me, exactly where I was standing in the dream, was my journal. The physical journal from my apartment, with its thick accumulation of entries and varying handwriting styles. I could see it clearly, could make out the wear patterns on the cover, and the way the pages bulged slightly from all the writing they contained. I tried to reach for it, but my arms wouldn't move. I tried to look away, but my gaze remained fixed on the impossible object. The journal lay there, solid and undeniably real, in a place that I had convinced myself existed only in my mind. The oval light pulsed once, brighter than it had ever been before, and I felt the familiar warmth spreading across my skin. The metallic voice spoke a single word in a language I finally understood, though I knew I would forget its meaning the moment I woke up. But I didn't wake up. The room remained exactly as it was. The journal continued to lie beside me, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hollow tap of footsteps on tile, growing steadily closer. Story 4. The door was unlocked upon arrival at 700 hours, showing no signs of forced entry. The interior was maintained in near-perfect order, with furniture alignment and surface cleanliness adhering to standard domestic practices. In the kitchen, 2 plates were positioned equidistantly on the table, each supporting a similar pattern of scattered crumbs. The stove was cool, indicating inactivity prior to the assessment. Bedroom linens were drawn tight, a approximate to military standards. The single window was secured, mitigate airflow irregularities. On the floor, a thin layer of dust remained undisturbed. The refrigerator emitted a low hum. Despite the conditions, a solitary shoe was positioned incorrectly, its pair absent from the scene. That's what I remember clearly. The rest comes in pieces, like static between radio stations. There was this sound, always this sound, a mechanical whirring that seemed to come from inside my skull, vibrating against my teeth. It would start low, almost imperceptible, then climb higher until my jaw ached. Sometimes I'd press my palms against my ears, but it never helped. The sound was already inside. I can still hear it now underneath everything else, like a frequency that never quite goes away. It made the air feel thick, made breathing feel deliberate. The walls would seem to pulse with it, as if the house itself had developed a heartbeat. I wasn't alone. I know I wasn't alone, even though I should have been. There was this presence, this weight in the room that pressed against my shoulders. It felt like being watched through glass, that prickly sensation of eyes tracking your movement. I'd turn around and find nothing, just empty space and furniture arranged in perfect lines, but the feeling persisted. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath, as if making noise would draw attention to something I didn't want to acknowledge. My skin would crawl with the certainty that someone was there, just outside my peripheral vision. The air would shift, barely noticeable, like when someone walks past you in a hallway. My thoughts weren't my thoughts, that's the only way I can describe it. Ideas would surface that felt foreign, clinical observations about my own behavior. I'd find myself cataloging details with mechanical precision, noting the exact angle of shadows on the wall, the specific temperature of door handles. These weren't things I normally paid attention to, but suddenly they felt crucial, as if someone was taking inventory through my eyes. My internal voice would shift, becoming formal, detached, speaking about me as if I were a specimen under observation. The disconnect was nauseating, like watching myself from outside my own body. The lights came first, sharp white flashes that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. They'd strobe through the windows even though there was nothing outside to cast them. The kitchen would illuminate in stark, surgical brightness, every surface gleaming like metal. Objects would appear different under that light, edges sharper, colors drained to gray. The refrigerator's hum would intensify, becoming almost musical, harmonizing with that persistent whirring in my head. Then darkness again, so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eyes. In those moments between light and dark, I'd catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there, shapes that moved with purpose, angular and precise. Something changed in me after that. My hands would shake for no reason, fine tremors that made holding things difficult. The taste of metal would coat my tongue, persistent and bitter. I'd find myself standing in rooms without remembering how I got there, staring at walls with an intensity that felt programmed. Sleep became fragmented, filled with the sensation of falling through geometric patterns. Even now, months later, I catch myself arranging objects in perfect parallel lines, measuring distances with my eyes, noting inconsistencies in my environment with an accuracy that feels learned rather than natural. But sometimes I remember it differently. Sometimes the lights were warm, golden, emanating from fixtures that hummed with contentment. The presence felt protective rather than invasive, like being wrapped in understanding. My thoughts would align perfectly, each observation flowing naturally into the next, creating a symphony of awareness. The mechanical sounds became rhythmic, soothing, like a lullaby designed for frequencies only I could hear. In this version, I wasn't being observed but welcomed, invited into something larger than my individual consciousness. The trembling in my hands felt like anticipation rather than fear, and the taste of metal was sweet, almost nostalgic. I don't try to figure it out anymore. Some experiences resist explanation, exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we actually understand. What matters is that something fundamental shifted, like a dial being turned to a frequency I never knew existed. I still find that single shoe sometimes in different places throughout the house, always perfectly positioned, always alone. I don't move it anymore. I've learned that some things are meant to remain exactly where they're found, markers of moments when reality becomes permeable, when the ordinary world reveals its hidden circuitry. The whirring continues, fainter now but constant, a reminder that I've been tuned to something beyond the normal range of human perception. I'm different now, calibrated to notice things others miss, and I'm not entirely sure I want to remember why. Story 5. The main corridor lay undisturbed when initial access was gained at 06:42 hours. Entry was facilitated through the side passage, which displayed no evidence of forced access. Each room was surveyed in sequential order, with no visible disturbances or altered fixtures observed. The air filtration system operated within normal parameters, and all safety indicators remained within acceptable thresholds. An inventory check revealed an absence of personal effects typically associated with occupancy. The surveillance equipment recorded a continuous feed, with no noted interruptions. Yet, an anomalous set of footprints, markedly distinct from standard issue footwear, traversed across the undisturbed layer of dust. I remember reading that report. I remember the taste of copper pennies when I swallowed. The paper felt too smooth between my fingers, like it had been pressed under something heavy for too long. But I don't remember walking those corridors myself, even though the footprints matched my shoes exactly. The buzzing started 3 weeks after I filed that report, not in my ears, deeper, behind my ribs where sound shouldn't reach. It comes at the same time every morning now, just as the first light touches the blinds in my apartment. The light is too white, it makes the walls breathe. There were lights behind the trees. I keep finding dust under my fingernails, clean dust, the kind that settles in places where air doesn't move. My apartment is on the 14th floor. There are no trees outside my windows. But I wake up with bark embedded in the creases of my palms and the smell of ozone clinging to my hair. The surveillance footage shows me entering the building at 06:41 hours, 1 minute before the official access time, but I don't remember arriving early. I don't remember the walk from the parking structure to the entrance. There's a gap where that memory should be, smooth and cold like the surface of still water. I watch the footage sometimes. The figure that looks like me moves differently, slower, the shoulders held too straight. When the camera angle switches to show the face, there's a delay, just a fraction of a second where the image stutters like a frame has been removed. The noise didn't come from outside. My skin tingles when I think about the corridors. The sensation starts at the base of my skull and spreads downward, following the curve of my spine. It's the same feeling I get when I stand too close to power lines, but softer, more patient, like something waiting just beneath the surface of my thoughts. The footprints in the dust were mine, but they were deeper than they should have been, as if I had been carrying something heavy, or as if something had been carrying me. I don't remember ever coming back. The air filtration system was working perfectly. That's what the report said. But when I close my eyes, I can taste the air from those corridors, metallic and sharp, like breathing through a mouthful of coins. It coats the inside of my throat and stays there for hours, no matter how much water I drink. The humming is getting louder. It synchronizes with my heartbeat now, creating a rhythm that doesn't belong to my body. Sometimes I catch myself walking in time with it, my footsteps echoing in patterns I don't remember learning. There's a door in my dreams that's always half open. The light that spills through the gap is too warm, like sunlight filtered through amber. But when I try to push it open further, my hand passes through the wood like it's made of water. The warmth spreads up my arm and into my chest, and I wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth. The surveillance equipment never stopped recording. Continuous feed, no interruptions, but there are moments in the footage where shadows move independently of their sources. Small discrepancies that accumulate like sediment, building layers of wrongness that stack higher each time I watch. I've been back to the building, not officially. The side passage is still unlocked, still shows no signs of forced entry, but the dust has been disturbed now. New footprints overlap the old ones, creating a pattern that spirals inward toward the center of each room. The electrical sound is strongest near the windows. It pulses in rhythm with something I can't identify, something that feels familiar but wrong, like hearing your own voice played back at the wrong speed. My reflection in the bathroom mirror arrives a split second after I do, just long enough to notice, just long enough to see myself from the outside, watching myself discover the delay. The fluorescent light above the mirror flickers in Morse code patterns, but I don't know Morse code. I've never learned it. There were no personal effects in any of the rooms, but I keep finding things in my pockets that don't belong to me. Smooth stones that are warm to the touch, pieces of paper with writing in my handwriting that I don't remember creating, phone numbers that connect to dead lines that ring with that same electrical pulse. The air was within normal parameters. The safety indicators were all green, but I wake up some mornings with my lungs full of that metallic taste, as if I've been breathing that filtered air all night. My apartment's ventilation system makes different sounds now, softer, more deliberate. Time moves differently when I think about the corridors. Minutes stretch like taffy, becoming elastic and strange. I'll start reading the report at 9 in the morning and look up to find the sun setting outside my window, the pages still crisp between my fingers as if no time has passed at all. The footprints traversed across the undisturbed dust, but dust doesn't stay undisturbed once it's been walked through. The contradiction sits in my mind like a splinter, working its way deeper each time I try to understand it. I can feel the building calling to me, not with sound, but with that same tingling sensation that starts behind my ribs and spreads outward. It's stronger at night when the city's electrical grid hums with the day's accumulated energy. The frequency matches something in my bones. There are gaps in my memory that fit the shape of those corridors perfectly. Smooth, empty spaces where experiences should be, outlined by the sharp edges of before and after. The report fills some of those gaps, but not all of them, not the important ones. The lights behind the trees pulse in the same rhythm as the humming in my chest. I've started timing them with my watch, but the numbers change each time I look away and look back. Time becomes negotiable in the space between the pulse and the light. I found a key in my jacket pocket, small and silver, warm like it's been held in someone's palm for hours. It doesn't fit any lock in my apartment, but it feels significant in a way that makes my skin prickle. The metal tastes like ozone when I hold it between my teeth. The surveillance footage shows me leaving the building at 11:17 hours, but I don't remember the walk back to the parking structure either. There's another gap, another smooth absence where memory should be. The figure that looks like me moves the same way going out as coming in, too straight, too deliberate. My dreams are getting longer. The door that's always half open leads to corridors that stretch further each night, branching into configurations that don't match the building's floor plan. The walls breathe in rhythm with my pulse, and the air tastes like copper and waiting. The anomalous footprints were markedly distinct from standard issue footwear, but they matched my shoes exactly. The contradiction doesn't resolve, just sits there like a weight in the center of my thoughts, growing heavier each time I try to lift it. I keep returning to the building. Each time the dust has settled differently, creating new patterns that spiral inward towards something I can't quite see. The electrical sound is getting stronger, more insistent. It knows I'm coming back. The buzzing behind my ribs has synchronized with the building's ventilation system. Even when I'm miles away, I can feel the rhythm of that filtered air moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. My lungs remember breathing it, even though the report says everything was within normal parameters. There were lights behind the trees, and they're getting brighter. The main corridor lay undisturbed when I gained access this morning at 06:42 hours. The side passage showed no evidence of forced entry, just like before, but the dust has been walked through now, disturbed by footprints that look like mine but feel like someone else's. The surveillance equipment records everything, but some things can't be captured on film. Some things live in the spaces between frames, in the pause between heartbeats, in the gap between leaving and never quite arriving back. Story 6. It was the soft tap of water landing on metal that drew my attention. Each drop seemed to punctuate a silence that didn't belong in my kitchen. I stepped away from the stove, where the smell of simmering broth faded into the background. The noise was subtle, yet it echoed through my mind like a distant chime. I found myself drawn to the sink, but the taps were firmly closed, dry as bone. The sound persisted, relentless, matching the slow tick of a clock I couldn't quite recall. My heart picked up its pace, resonating with the rhythm. The air around me felt dense, pulling at my thoughts, aligning them with an evening years past of waiting, of counting time by the drop. It was impossible then, and even more so now, to ignore. I'm trying to remember. That's what I do now mostly. Sit here and try to piece together what happened to me. The fragments come in waves, crashing against the inside of my skull like broken glass. Some pieces are sharp and clear. Others dissolve the moment I reach for them. The water sound, it comes back to me in dreams, but was it really water? I think about this constantly. The metallic ping, 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 like someone tapping a spoon against the rim of an empty can, or maybe it was blood. Blood has that same thick quality when it falls, doesn't it? I wouldn't know. I don't think I would know. There was a room. I remember the walls were the color of old teeth, yellow-white, stained with something I couldn't identify. The light came from somewhere behind me, casting my shadow long and twisted across the floor. I was standing there, but I don't remember walking in. I don't remember the door opening. Just the sudden awareness that I was there, breathing air that tasted like copper pennies. My hands shake when I write this. They shake when I think about the humming. The humming started low, so low I felt it in my bones before I heard it with my ears. It vibrated through the floorboards, up through my feet, settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I pressed my palms against the walls, trying to find the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from inside the walls, from inside me. But maybe that was later, or earlier. Time doesn't work the way it should in my memories. Everything blades together like watercolors in the rain. I remember sunlight streaming through a window, dust motes dancing in the beam, the smell of coffee cooling in a mug I never finished drinking. These normal things feel sacred now, precious in their simplicity. I cling to them when the other memories surface, the ones that make my skin crawl and my throat close up. There was a figure standing perfectly still in the corner of my vision. When I turned to look directly, nothing. But the peripheral awareness remained, that sense of being watched, studied. The way you feel when you're alone in a house but know someone else is breathing in the next room. I keep trying to understand the sequence. What came first? The sound of water that wasn't water, the yellow room, the humming that lived in my bones, or was it the touch? The touch, God, the touch. Fingers that weren't quite fingers pressing against my shoulder blade. Not rough, not gentle, just there, present, real. The temperature was wrong, too warm, like fever skin, but with an underlying coldness that seeped through my shirt and into my muscles. I spun around, but my movement felt sluggish, like moving through thick honey. Nothing behind me, just empty space and the lingering sensation of that impossible touch. I found marks later, or did I? Sometimes I think I imagined them. 5 small bruises on my back, perfectly spaced like fingertips. But when I tried to show someone, they'd faded, or maybe they were never there. Maybe my mind created them, desperate to make sense of the senseless. The smell comes back to me now. Metallic, yes, but also organic, like wet earth mixed with hot metal. Like a basement after heavy rain, but sharper, more immediate. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I showered until the water ran cold, but I could still smell it. Still can sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep. There was a door, I'm certain of this, even when I doubt everything else. A door that shouldn't have been there. I'd walked through that hallway 1,000 times, but suddenly there it was painted the same color as the walls. Almost invisible except for the thin line of light bleeding out from underneath. The light was wrong, too bright, too white, hospital lights but colder. It hurt to look at, but I couldn't turn away. My hand reached for the doorknob without my permission, fingers closing around metal so cold it burned. Did I open it? I think I opened it, but what was on the other side shifts and changes every time I try to remember. Sometimes it's another room, identical to the one I'm standing in, stretching infinitely. Sometimes it's nothing, just white void that makes my eyes water. Sometimes it's something else entirely, something my mind refuses to hold on to. The headaches started after that, or maybe they started before. Sharp, sudden pains that feel like ice picks driven behind my left eye. They come without warning, lasting just long enough to steal my breath and leave me gasping. I've been to doctors, they run their tests, take their pictures of the inside of my head. Everything looks normal, they say. Nothing wrong that they can see, but they don't know about the humming. They don't know about the door that appears and disappears like a fever dream. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy. If trauma can break your brain so completely that you start inventing impossible things to fill the gaps. But the sensations are too real, too specific. The weight of that touch on my shoulder, the taste of copper air, the way my shadow looked wrong in that yellow room. I dream about walking backwards, strange, but it feels important. In the dreams, I'm retracing my steps, trying to undo whatever I did, whatever I saw. But you can't unring a bell, can you? You can't unsee what's already burned into your retinas. The water sound is back right now as I write this. Ping, ping, ping against metal. I check the faucets, but they're dry. I check the ceiling for lakes, but it's solid. The sound exists only in my head, but it's as real as my own heartbeat. I'm starting to think the water was never water at all. There's something else, something I haven't written down because writing it makes it real, and I'm not ready for it to be real. But it's growing stronger, this memory, pushing against the walls I've built around it. There was a voice, not speaking words exactly, but communicating somehow. directly into my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. It told me things, showed me things, but the content slips away like smoke every time I try to grasp it. What I do remember is the feeling it left behind, a hollow sensation in my chest, like something important had been scooped out and taken away. I've felt incomplete ever since, like I'm missing some essential part of myself. The bruises on my back, if they were ever real, they didn't hurt. That's what bothers me most. Something touched me with enough force to leave marks, but there was no pain, just that wrong temperature and the lingering awareness of presence. I keep returning to the yellow room in my mind, the stained walls, the light from behind, the shadow that looked like me but felt like someone else. I was waiting for something in that room, or someone was waiting for me. The distinction feels important, but I can't grasp why. The humming is getting louder. Not right now, not in reality, but in my memory, it's growing stronger each time I revisit that place, like a radio signal coming into focus. Soon I think I'll be able to make out the tune, if it is a tune, or maybe I'll understand what it's trying to tell me. I found something in my pocket afterward, a small piece of metal, warm to the touch despite having been in my cold pocket for hours. It was perfectly smooth, no edges or markings, about the size of a coin but thicker. When I held it up to the light, it seemed to absorb the illumination rather than reflect it. I kept it for months, turning it over in my fingers when the memories got too sharp. But one morning it was gone, not lost, gone, no longer existing in the same way it had before. The absence felt deliberate, purposeful. Someone is taking my memories, or something is, piece by piece, detail by detail. What I remember now is different from what I remembered yesterday. The colors are fading. The sounds are becoming muffled. Even the fear is dulling around the edges. But the water sound persists. Ping, ping, ping. I think it's counting down to something. The figure in my peripheral vision is getting bolder, less careful about staying hidden. Sometimes I catch glimpses of a shoulder, a hand, the edge of a face that doesn't look quite right. The proportions are off in ways I can't articulate. I'm running out of time to remember. I can feel the memories being pulled away, drawn into some vast emptiness that hungers for my experiences. Soon there will be nothing left but the sound of water that isn't water and the knowledge that something profound was taken from me. The door is back. I can see the light underneath, brighter than before. My hand is already reaching for the knob, fingers closing around metal that burns with impossible cold. This time I think I'll remember what's on the other side. This time I think it wants me to remember. The humming has stopped. The sudden silence is worse than the sound ever was. In the quiet, I can hear something else breathing that isn't mine, footsteps that don't belong to my feet. Something is waking up, something that's been sleeping in the spaces between my memories, feeding on the fragments I've lost. It's almost ready now. Almost strong enough to step out of the shadows and into the light. I should stop writing. I should walk away from this desk, leave this house, drive until I run out of road. But my hand keeps moving across the page, forming words I don't remember thinking. The water sound isn't coming from the kitchen anymore. It's coming from inside my head, behind my eyes, where thoughts live and memories die. Ping, 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 marking time until something that shouldn't exist decides it's ready to exist anyway. I can feel it stirring now, stretching limbs that aren't quite limbs, opening eyes that see in directions that don't have names. It's been patient, so patient, waiting for me to remember enough to make the connection complete. The yellow room was never a room, the door was never a door, the touch was never just a touch. They were invitations. And I think I finally understand what I was invited to become. The humming is starting again, but now it's coming from my own throat. I don't remember learning the tune, but my body knows it perfectly. Each note resonates in my bones, calling to something vast and patient that has been waiting in the spaces between seconds. I'm going to stop writing now, not because I want to, but because the part of me that could want things is getting smaller. What's taking its place is older, hungrier, and it has no use for words or memories or the small human concerns that used to fill my days. The water sound has changed. It's not counting down anymore. It's counting up story 7. The door closed with a soft thud behind me. My fingers tingled from the cool metal of the knob, its chill lingering as I pressed my palm against the smooth wall. The air held a stale tension, a quiet resonance that crawled under my skin. I noticed the floor felt subtly uneven, as if an unseen weight had shifted beneath it. It was a sensation that made my breath catch just a little. As the stillness deepened, the familiar creak didn't echo the way it used to. I stand here now knowing I can never return to the other side. The choice has been made, though I'm not sure when exactly I stopped having choices at all. My reflection in the brass doorknob shows eyes that have seen too much, pupils dilated in a way that makes me look like someone else entirely. Someone I used to know, perhaps. The walls around me pulse with a rhythm I recognize but cannot name, and I understand now that this was always where I would end up. The only question left is how I got here. But memory works differently now. It flows backward like water finding its source, each recollection pulling me deeper into what came before. I close my eyes and let it take me. The knob was already turning in my hand, the metal warming under my grip. I remember hesitating at the threshold, looking back over my shoulder at the room I was leaving. The furniture had been rearranged somehow, chairs pushed against walls at odd angles, as if something large had moved through the space. The carpet showed indentations in patterns that didn't match any furniture I owned. My coffee cup sat on the table, still steaming, though I couldn't recall making coffee. The liquid inside was darker than it should have been, almost black, with an oily sheen that caught the light. I had been packing, I think. Yes, there was a suitcase open on the bed, half filled with clothes that weren't quite mine. They fit me certainly, but the colors were wrong, the fabrics too rough or too smooth against my skin. Someone had been helping me pack, their hands occasionally brushing mine as we folded shirts and rolled socks. Those hands were cold, colder than hands should be, and they left no prints on the fabric. The decision to leave had come suddenly, though when I trace it back, it feels like something I had always been planning. The voice on the phone had been calm, reassuring, speaking in a tone I recognized but couldn't place. They knew things about me that I hadn't told anyone, small details about my childhood, the way I took my coffee, the name of my first pet. When I asked how they knew these things, they laughed softly and said I had told them myself, though I had no memory of any such conversation. Before the phone call, I had been sitting in my kitchen, staring at the morning light as it filtered through the window. But the light was wrong somehow, casting shadows that bent in impossible directions. The shadow of my coffee mug stretched across the table like a dark finger, pointing toward something I couldn't see. When I moved the mug, the shadow remained, frozen in place, as if it had forgotten how to follow. I had woken that morning with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't been gardening. The dirt was black and rich, the kind that comes from deep in the earth, and it smelled of things that had been buried too long. No matter how hard I scrubbed, traces of it remained, dark crescents that made my hands look like they belonged to someone else. In the mirror, my face was pale except for a thin line of that same dark earth along my hairline, as if I had been lying face down in soil. The dreams had been getting stronger, more vivid, bleeding into my waking hours until I couldn't tell where sleep ended and consciousness began. In these dreams, I walked through places I had never been, down corridors that stretched longer with each step, past doors that opened onto rooms filled with my own belongings arranged in ways that made no sense. My grandmother's china set stacked in precarious towers, my books arranged by the color of their spines rather than alphabetically, my photographs turned face down on every surface. But before the dreams came the sounds. At first, just a gentle tapping, like rain on glass, though it never coincided with actual weather. The tapping would start in one corner of the house and move slowly along the walls, following a path that seemed to map the interior structure in ways I didn't understand. I would follow the sound, pressing my ear to the wall, feeling vibrations that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the foundation. The tapping had started the morning after I found the letter. Not a letter exactly, but a piece of paper slipped under my door while I slept. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important documents, and it bore a message written in my own handwriting. The words were mine, the loops and curves of each letter perfectly familiar, but I had no memory of writing them. The message was simple: "You are ready now. The door will be waiting." I had kept the paper in my pocket, checking it throughout the days that followed, watching as the ink seemed to fade and darken in cycles, as if the words were breathing. Sometimes, when I wasn't looking directly at it, I could swear the message changed, adding words or rearranging them into new configurations. But whenever I focused on it completely, it returned to that original, impossible sentence. The door the letter mentioned wasn't my front door or back door, but one I had never noticed before, tucked into an alcove in my basement that I could have sworn was just a blank wall. The door was old, older than the house itself, made of wood that had been painted so many times the surface was smooth as glass. There was no lock, just that brass knob that always felt cold to the touch, and when I pressed my ear against the wood, I could hear something like breathing on the other side. I had found the basement changed one morning when I went down to check the water heater. The walls, previously concrete, were now lined with that same dark wood as the door. The floor, once bare cement, was covered in thick carpet that muffled my footsteps completely. The single bulb that had always illuminated the space was gone, replaced by a series of small lights embedded in the ceiling, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that made the space feel larger than it should have been. But the basement had been normal when I first started hearing the footsteps above my head. Light, careful steps that moved through my house while I was in bed, following a pattern that never varied. From the kitchen to the living room, pausing at the window, then continuing down the hall to stop just outside my bedroom door. The footsteps never entered my room, just waited there, patient and still, until I finally fell back asleep. I had begun leaving things out to test whether someone was really there. A glass of water on the kitchen counter, a book open to a specific page, a chair pulled out from the table. Each morning these items would be subtly altered. The water glass moved 3 inches to the left, the book turned to a different page, the chair pushed back in but not quite aligned with the table. Small changes, easily explained away, but consistent enough to make me question my own memory. The footsteps had started the night I brought the box up from storage. I had been cleaning, organizing, trying to make sense of belongings that seemed to have multiplied when I wasn't looking. The box was labeled in my handwriting, though I didn't remember packing it or writing the label. Inside were photographs of places I had never been, taken from perspectives that suggested I had been there, standing in those exact spots. In one photo, I could see my own shadow stretching across unfamiliar ground, though I had no memory of casting it. There were other things in the box. A a key that didn't fit any lock in my house, a small notebook filled with observations written in my hand about people I had never met, a map of my neighborhood with certain houses circled in red ink. My house was circled too, but so were three others, connected by lines that formed a pattern I couldn't decipher. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a brass doorknob identical to the one I would later find on that impossible door. I had found the box while searching for something else entirely, though now I can't remember what I had been looking for. It was tucked behind old holiday decorations, covered in dust that seemed too thick for the time it had supposedly been stored. When I lifted it, the box felt heavier than it should have, and something inside shifted with a sound like sand or small stones settling. The search had begun because things in my house were not where I remembered leaving them. Books reshuffled on shelves, furniture moved just slightly out of place, food in my refrigerator that I didn't remember buying. The changes were subtle enough that I questioned whether I was simply forgetting, but consistent enough to create a constant sense of unease. My house no longer felt entirely mine, as if someone else was living there alongside me, making small adjustments to suit their preferences. It started with the milk. I had gone to bed with a full carton in the refrigerator, but woke to find it nearly empty, though I rarely drank milk and had no memory of using it. The expiration date was the same, but the milk itself tasted different, richer somehow, with an aftertaste that lingered long after I swallowed. When I poured it into a glass, it moved more slowly than milk should, coating the sides with a film that caught the light. The morning I noticed the milk, I also found my back door unlocked, though I was certain I had secured it before bed. The lock wasn't broken, the door wasn't damaged, it was simply open, as if someone had used a key. But I had the only key, and it was exactly where I had left it, hanging on its hook by the door. When I examined the lock more closely, I found scratches around the keyhole, fresh marks in the metal that suggested someone had been practicing, learning the mechanism through repetition. That was the morning I first noticed the taste in my mouth when I woke up, a metallic flavor like old coins, accompanied by the sensation that I had been speaking in my sleep, though I lived alone and had no one to confirm this. My throat felt raw, as if I had been talking for hours, and my tongue was slightly numb, the way it gets after eating something too hot or too cold. All of this traced back to the night I found the small hole in my bedroom wall, perfectly round, about the size of a pencil, positioned at eye level when I was lying in bed. I had noticed it because something glinted in the darkness beyond, a reflection of light from somewhere deeper in the wall. When I put my eye to the hole, I could see into a space that shouldn't have existed, a narrow passage that ran between the walls of my house, lined with the same dark wood I would later find in my basement. The hole hadn't been there before. I was certain of this because I had painted that wall recently, covering every inch with careful, even strokes. The paint around the hole was undisturbed, as if the opening had always been there, as if I had painted around it without noticing. But that was impossible. I remembered every detail of that painting project, the way the light fell across the wall, the satisfaction of covering the old color with something fresh and clean. I had decided to paint because of the stain that had appeared overnight, a dark mark roughly the size of a handprint, positioned exactly where someone lying in my bed might reach out to touch the wall. The stain was deep, penetrating through multiple layers of old paint, and no amount of scrubbing could remove it. When I touched it, my fingers came away clean, but the mark remained, as if it existed in the wall itself rather than on its surface. The stain had appeared the morning after I heard my own voice calling my name from somewhere inside the house. I had been in the kitchen making coffee when I heard it distinctly, my voice coming from upstairs, calling down to me with an urgency that made my heart race. But I was alone, had been alone all night, and when I searched the house, I found nothing out of place except for the faint echo of my own voice seeming to linger in the air. That voice, I now realize, had been calling me toward something. Each time I heard it, I felt compelled to follow, to search, to investigate. It was leading me deeper into my own house, showing me things that had always been there but that I had somehow never noticed. The voice was patient, persistent, drawing me step by step toward discoveries that felt both shocking and inevitable. The voice had started as a whisper, so quiet I thought it might be the wind or the settling of the house. But gradually it grew clearer, more distinct, until I could make out words, then sentences, then entire conversations that seemed to be happening just out of sight. The voice knew things about me, shared memories I had forgotten, reminded me of dreams I had dismissed as meaningless. It began the night I found the photograph of myself as a child, standing in front of a house I had never seen before, holding the hand of someone who had been carefully cut out of the picture. The photograph was tucked inside a book I had been reading, marking a page I had never bookmarked. In the photo, my child self was smiling, but there was something wrong with the expression, a forced quality that suggested fear rather than happiness. I had been reading that book for comfort, a familiar story I had enjoyed many times before. But this time the words seemed different, rearranged somehow, telling a story I didn't recognize, though the book itself was unchanged. Characters I remembered as kind were now cruel, plot points I recalled as resolved were left hanging, and throughout the narrative there were small references to things that seemed to describe my own life with uncomfortable accuracy. The book had been a gift, though I couldn't remember who had given it to me or when I had received it. Inside the front cover there was an inscription in handwriting I almost recognized, for the one who remembers everything and nothing. The ink was faded, suggesting age, but the book itself looked new, its spine uncracked, its pages clean and white. Everything started with that book appearing on my nightstand one morning where I was certain no book had been the night before. It was positioned perfectly, as if someone had placed it there with great care, angled so that the title caught the morning light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. When I picked it up, it fell open naturally to a page near the middle where a single sentence had been underlined in pencil. The door was always there, waiting for someone brave enough to notice it. Story 8. I remained anchored to the floor, eyes locked on the distant corner where the wall met the ceiling. A low creak echoed sporadically, but the floor beneath me stayed unnervingly quiet. The air felt dense, charged with an expectancy that pressed against the edges of my awareness. The wallpaper seemed to flutter slightly, yet no breeze stirred the room. My heartbeat matched the ticking of the clock, both steady yet out of sync. Then a barely perceptible shift, a light shadow that shouldn't exist formed against the far wall, testing my patience with its silent intrusion. The mornings come wrong now. I wake with the taste of copper pennies coating my tongue, though I haven't touched metal in days. My sheets are damp with a moisture that isn't sweat, something cooler, more deliberate. The bedroom window faces east, but the light that filters through feels borrowed from somewhere else, carrying frequencies that make my teeth ache. I've been having the same dream for weeks, or maybe it isn't a dream. The distinction blurs when I try to focus on it, like staring at something through water that keeps moving. There's a door in my apartment that I don't remember opening, yet it stands slightly ajar each morning. The gap measures exactly 3 inches. I've checked multiple times. The electrical hum started before the dreams, or perhaps they began together. It lives in the walls now, a constant companion that rises and falls with my breathing. When I press my ear to the plaster, the sound grows distant, as if it's traveling away from me through miles of hidden conduit. But when I pull back, it's there again, patient and waiting. There were lights behind the trees. My reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes lags, just by a fraction of a second, but enough to notice. I'll turn my head left, and my mirrored self follows a beat later, like it's receiving delayed instructions. The fluorescent bulb above the sink flickers in patterns that almost resemble Morse code, but when I try to decode the sequence, it shifts to something else entirely. The taste of copper returns stronger each day. It's accompanied by a smell I can't place something sharp and clean, like the air after lightning strikes too close. My fingertips tingle constantly now, as if I've been handling live wires. When I touch doorknobs, light switches, or the metal frame of my bed, tiny sparks jump between my skin and the surface. But there's no pain, only a strange sense of recognition. I don't remember ever coming back. The door stands 3 inches ajar, always 3 inches. I've measured it obsessively, marking the exact position with a pencil line on the floor. But each morning, despite closing it firmly the night before, there it is, that perfect gap letting in air that tastes of ozone and possibilities. Through the opening I can see a sliver of the hallway, but the geometry seems wrong. The opposite wall appears farther away than it should be, stretching into a distance that doesn't fit the building's blueprint. Sleep brings fragments that scatter when I reach for them. A ceiling that breathes, walls that pulse with their own heartbeat, the sensation of floating while my body remains pressed against the mattress. Sometimes I wake to find my bedroom furniture rearranged in subtle ways, the dresser shifted 2 inches to the left, the chair turned to face a different direction. But I live alone, and the door locks from the inside. The noise didn't come from outside. In the kitchen, water drips from the faucet in intervals that match the electrical hum. Each drop creates ripples in the sink that spread in perfect circles, but the circles linger too long, defying physics with their persistence. When I cup the water in my palms, it feels heavier than it should, dense with minerals that don't exist in the city's supply. The liquid leaves a residue on my skin, a film that catches light at impossible angles. My neighbor's dog stopped barking 3 weeks ago. The silence where its voice used to be feels carved out of the air, a dog-shaped absence that follows me down the hallway. Other sounds have vanished too. The building's heating system no longer clanks through the pipes. Traffic noise from the street below has faded to a whisper, but the electrical hum grows stronger, filling the spaces where familiar sounds once lived. The shadow on the far wall returns each evening at the same time. It forms slowly, like developing film, emerging from nothing into a shape that suggests movement without actually moving. When I approach it, my footsteps echo strangely, as if the floor has become hollow beneath my feet. The shadow doesn't respond to my presence, it simply exists, patient and purposeful, waiting for something I can't understand. I've started leaving notes for myself, scattered throughout the apartment like breadcrumbs. Reminders of things I might forget, observations about changes I might not notice. But each morning I find notes I don't remember writing, in handwriting that looks almost like mine, but tilted at slightly wrong angles. They contain information I shouldn't know: the exact temperature of the air in rooms I haven't entered, the number of heartbeats I experience during sleep, measurements of distances that don't correspond to any space in my apartment. The wallpaper breathes, not metaphorically, literally. I can see it expanding and contracting with each cycle, as if the walls have developed lungs. The pattern shifts during these breathing moments, flowers blooming and wilting in accelerated time, geometric shapes rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt to look at directly. When I press my palm against the surface, I feel warmth pulsing beneath the paper, a rhythm that doesn't match my own heartbeat but seems to be teaching it a new tempo. There were lights behind the trees, and they knew my name. The copper taste has evolved into something more complex: metal and ozone mixed with flavors I don't have words for. My tongue feels different in my mouth, more sensitive to textures and temperatures. Food tastes muted now, as if my taste buds are being recalibrated for substances that don't exist in normal kitchens. Water is the only thing that tastes right, and even that carries undertones of electricity in distant places. Time moves differently in certain rooms. The bathroom stretches minutes into hours, while the kitchen compresses entire afternoons into moments. I've tested this with clocks, but the clocks themselves seem affected, their faces showing times that don't align with any earthly schedule. The hands move in directions that shouldn't be possible, sweeping through numbers that don't exist on standard timepieces. My skin tingles constantly now, as if I'm standing in a field of static electricity. The sensation is strongest in my fingertips and the back of my neck, spreading in waves that follow patterns I'm beginning to recognize. When the tingling reaches its peak, the electrical hum in the walls harmonizes with it, creating frequencies that make my bones resonate. During these moments, I can almost remember something important, something that happened in a place where the air tasted like copper and the light came from directions that don't have names. The door measures exactly 3 inches. The gap never varies, never widens or narrows by even a millimeter. But what lies beyond the gap changes. Sometimes it's the familiar hallway with its worn carpet and peeling paint. Other times it's a corridor that stretches impossibly far, lined with doors that mirror my own, each standing 3 inches ajar. In those moments, I can hear sounds from the other side, footsteps that match my rhythm, voices that echo my breathing, the same electrical hum multiplied across infinite spaces. I don't remember ever coming back, but I must have left. The mirror lag has increased. Now there's a full second delay between my movements and my reflection's response. During that second, I can see something else in the mirror, not my face, but something that wears my features like a mask that doesn't quite fit. The fluorescent bulb's Morse code pattern has become more insistent, flashing sequences that feel like messages I should understand. When I close my eyes, I can still see the flashing, burned into my retinas in colors that don't exist in normal light spectrums. Objects in my apartment have begun to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. The coffee mug migrates across the counter in tiny increments. Books rearrange themselves on shelves, organizing by some system I can't decipher. The furniture doesn't just move, it improves its positioning, as if something is optimizing the space for purposes I'm not aware of. Each change feels deliberate, part of a larger pattern that's transforming my living space into something more functional for activities I don't remember performing. The wallpaper's breathing has synchronized with my own. When I inhale, the patterns expand and brighten. When I exhale, they contract and dim. This connection feels ancient, as if the walls and I have been breathing together for much longer than I've lived in this apartment. The flowers in the pattern have begun to turn toward me as I move through rooms, following my progress like living things tracking sunlight. The noise didn't come from outside, but it came from somewhere. Sleep has become a different country with its own geography and physics. I dream of rooms that exist in the spaces between my rooms, corridors that connect to hallways I've never walked, windows that look out onto landscapes composed entirely of electrical light. In these dreams, I float through spaces where the air has weight and substance, where breathing requires conscious effort, where every surface hums with the same frequency that lives in my walls. The copper taste now carries traces of something sweeter, not sugar, but the kind of sweetness that exists in flower petals and morning air. My fingertips have developed a sensitivity that borders on psychic. When I touch surfaces, I can feel their history, sense the hands that touched them before mine, detect the emotional residue left by previous interactions. The metal objects in my apartment pulse with stored energy, as if they're batteries charged by sources I can't identify. The shadow on the wall has begun to move. Not dramatically, just small adjustments, subtle shifts that suggest awareness. When I speak to it, the electrical hum changes pitch, rising and falling in patterns that almost resemble responses. The shadow seems to be listening, processing my words through circuits that exist in dimensions I can't perceive. Sometimes I catch myself having conversations with it, though I never remember starting them. There were lights behind the trees, and they knew my name, and they're calling it now. The 3-inch gap has become a focal point for energies I'm learning to recognize. Air flows through it in currents that carry information, molecular messages, chemical communications, electromagnetic whispers. When I position myself at the right angle, I can see through the gap into spaces that definitely don't exist in my building. Vast chambers filled with soft light, corridors that curve in impossible directions, rooms where the walls breathe in perfect unison with mine. My reflection has stopped lagging. Now it moves slightly ahead of me, anticipating my actions by fractions of seconds. It knows which way I'm going to turn my head before I decide to turn it. When I smile, it's already smiling. When I frown, the expression is already forming on its face. The fluorescent bulb has stopped flickering in random patterns. Now it pulses in steady rhythms that match my heartbeat, as if it's monitoring my vital signs for purposes I'm not supposed to understand. The apartment has become a living system with me as one of its organs. The walls breathe, the floors pulse with hidden currents, the ceiling radiates warmth that has nothing to do with heating systems. I'm not living in this space anymore, I'm part of it, integrated into its functions like a component in a machine designed for purposes that exist beyond normal understanding. The electrical hum isn't coming from the walls, it's coming from me, generated by processes that have rewired my nervous system into something more compatible with the frequencies that govern this transformed space. I don't remember ever coming back, but I never really left. The taste of copper has become permanent, no longer rising and fading, but constant as breathing. It's not unpleasant anymore, it tastes like home, like the flavor my mouth was always meant to carry. The tingling in my fingertips has spread throughout my body, a gentle electrical current that connects me to every metal surface, every electronic device, every source of power in the building. When I touch light switches now, I don't turn lights on, I communicate with them, negotiating brightness levels through direct neural interface. The door stands exactly 3 inches ajar, and through that gap I can see myself standing in another room, looking back through another gap at me. The corridor between us stretches infinitely in both directions, lined with versions of the same door, each open to the same precise measurement. We're all looking at each other across impossible distances, all breathing in perfect synchronization, all tasting copper and feeling the same electrical hum resonating through our transformed bodies. The shadow on the wall isn't a shadow anymore. It's a window, and through it I can see the place where the lights live behind trees that grow in directions that don't have names. The trees are calling my name, and I remember now I've been calling back, having conversations that span frequencies beyond human hearing, participating in exchanges that require no words because they happen at the cellular level, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breathing in and breathing out. I remained anchored to the floor, eyes locked on the distant corner where the wall met the ceiling. The wallpaper breathed with me, and the electrical hum sang my name in frequencies that tasted like copper and felt like coming home. Story 9. Each morning as I sipped my coffee, the old grandfather clock in the lobby would chime precisely at 8. Its deep, echoing tone was oddly comforting, marking the start of another day. For years it never failed, until recently when a faint hesitation crept into its rhythm, an almost indiscernible pause. I thought it was my imagination when it skipped a chime last Tuesday. but yesterday it chimed twice within seconds. Today it remained silent altogether, leaving a disconcerting emptiness hanging in the air. I can't shake the feeling that these skips mean something, though I can't quite place it. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does. I'm writing because I need to tell someone, anyone, even if that someone is just the empty space between these words, the silence that follows when I stop typing. I've carried this weight for so long now that it's become part of me, like a second heartbeat that only I can hear. But hearts weren't meant to beat in pairs, were they? You have to understand, I was never the type to believe in things I couldn't explain. I paid my bills on time, kept my apartment clean, nodded politely at neighbors whose names I'd forgotten years ago. I lived in the spaces between certainties, comfortable in my small, predictable world, until the clock started acting strange. That first skip, God, how do I even describe it? It wasn't just that the chime came late. It was like time itself hesitated, caught its breath, looked around confused before remembering what it was supposed to be doing. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, and felt something shift, not in the building, in me. The sound that followed wasn't quite silence, it was expectant, waiting. I should have moved apartments then. Should have packed my few belongings and found somewhere else, somewhere with digital clocks and no history seeping through the walls. But you know how it is when something hooks into you, you tell yourself it's nothing, that you're being dramatic, that morning coffee just hits different some days. The thing is, I started noticing other sounds after that, or maybe they were always there and the clock stuttering just tuned my ears to a different frequency. A soft tapping behind my bedroom wall, rhythmic like Morse code, but spelling out nothing I could understand. The elevator cables humming melodies that seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered lullabies from a childhood I wasn't sure I'd actually lived. And the footsteps, Jesus, the footsteps. They started maybe a week after the first skip. Always above me, always at night when the building should have been settling into sleep. Slow, deliberate steps that would pace back and forth across what I knew was an empty apartment. I'd called the superintendent once early on before I understood that some questions don't have answers you want to hear. He'd looked at me with eyes that were too knowing, too sad, and told me the unit above mine had been vacant for months. I went up there myself one night, stood in the hallway with my ear pressed against the door, listening to those measured steps, feeling the vibrations travel through the wood and into my skull. The footsteps stopped when I touched the door, just stopped, like whoever was in there knew I was listening, like they were listening back. The door was locked, of course, but through the keyhole I could see light. Warm, golden light that moved like candle flame, casting shadows that danced on walls I couldn't see. I knelt there for what felt like hours. I pressed to that tiny opening, watching light that shouldn't exist in a space that shouldn't be occupied. When I finally stood up, my knees cracking in the silence, I realized the footsteps had started again. But now they were below me, in my own apartment. I ran down those stairs so fast I nearly fell, key fumbling in the lock, heart hammering against my ribs like something caged and desperate. My apartment was empty, of course, dark, cold, but the air felt recently disturbed, like someone had just walked through it, displacing molecules and leaving traces of presence in their wake. That's when I started staying awake. Sleep became something other people did, something I remembered from before. I'd sit in my kitchen chair, the one that faced the living room and the front door and the windows that looked out onto nothing important, and I'd wait. For what, I couldn't say, but waiting felt necessary, like a job I'd been assigned without being told the details. The clock kept getting worse, skipping beats, doubling up, sometimes chiming at hours that didn't exist. 3:30 became its favorite time to sing, that dead hour when night is heaviest and morning feels like a lie we tell ourselves. I started setting my phone alarm to match the clock's chimes, but my phone would go silent too, or ring at the wrong times, or display times that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Time was becoming unreliable, and when time goes soft, everything else follows. I began noticing changes in my reflection. Nothing dramatic, I'm not talking about growing extra eyes or watching my face melt. Just inconsistencies. My hair would be parted on the left when I remembered combing it to the right. The scar on my chin from a childhood accident would appear lighter some days, darker others, sometimes missing entirely. My eyes looked tired even when I felt alert, alert when exhaustion should have been written all over my face. But the worst part was how other people started looking at me, or rather, how they stopped looking at me. The woman at the coffee shop who'd known my order for 3 years suddenly stared at me blankly when I walked in. The mailman I'd exchanged pleasantries with every day began delivering my mail to the wrong box, as if he couldn't quite remember which apartment was mine. My own mother, when I called her, paused too long after I said hello, like she was trying to place my voice. I started carrying my driver's license everywhere, checking it obsessively to make sure my face was still the one printed on the plastic. It was, but sometimes the photo looked like a stranger wearing my features, someone who'd learned to imitate my expressions without understanding what they meant. The footsteps above me became constant, not just at night now, but during the day, during my meals, during the few moments when I'd try to shower or change clothes. Always the same measured pace, back and forth, like someone walking the length of a cage. I'd find myself matching the rhythm with my own steps, pacing my kitchen in time with the sounds above, until I'd catch myself and stop, horrified by how natural it felt. One night, or maybe it was day, time had become negotiable. By then I heard my own voice coming through the ceiling. Just fragments, words I recognized but couldn't place. My laugh, but pitched wrong, lasting too long. The sound of my footsteps, but heavier, more deliberate than I remembered making them. That's when I understood. The apartment above me wasn't empty. It was occupied by someone who was learning to be me. I should have been terrified, should have run screaming into the street, should have called someone, should have done something other than sit in my kitchen chair and listen to myself being practiced by someone else. But terror requires energy I no longer had. Instead, I felt a strange kind of relief. Finally, an explanation that made sense, even if it made no sense at all. The clock chimed 13 times that night. I counted them, wrote them down, watched the numbers on the page to make sure they didn't change when I wasn't looking. 13 chimes for an hour that didn't exist, marking time in a world that had quietly shifted around me while I wasn't paying attention. I started leaving things out for whoever was upstairs. Nothing dramatic, just a cup of coffee on my kitchen counter, positioned where it might send steam toward the ceiling. A book left open to a page I'd been reading, in case they wanted to know what I'd been thinking about. My spare key, placed on the windowsill where the light would catch it just right. The offerings disappeared, not all at once, not obviously. The coffee would be gone by morning, but I'd find the cup washed and returned to my cabinet. The book would be closed, but with a different page bookmarked. The key would be back on the sill, but facing a different direction, catching the light at a new angle. We were sharing the space now, me and whoever was learning to be me. They were getting better at it. The footsteps above matched my gait perfectly. The voice through the ceiling had learned my inflections, my pauses, the way I hummed unconsciously when I was thinking. And I was getting worse at being myself. My movements became uncertain, like I was forgetting the choreography of my own body. I'd reach for things and miss by inches, as if my hands weren't quite where I thought they were. Food tasted different, colors looked muted, sounds seemed to come from slightly the wrong direction. I was becoming a rough draft of myself while someone else perfected the final copy. The mirror in my bathroom stopped reflecting me altogether last week. I'd stand in front of it, brush my teeth, comb my hair, but the glass would show only the wall behind me, the shower curtain, the small window that never let in quite enough light. I wasn't disappearing, I could still see my hands moving, still feel the toothbrush against my teeth, but mirrors had apparently decided I wasn't worth reflecting anymore. Other people stopped seeing me entirely around the same time. I'd walk through crowds and no one would step aside. Cashiers would look through me, waiting for the next customer. My phone stopped ringing, my mail stopped coming. The world was gently, politely forgetting I existed. But I could still hear the footsteps above me, still hear my own voice being rehearsed, perfected, made ready for a performance I wasn't invited to watch. I think I understand now what the clock was trying to tell me with its skips and stutters. Time wasn't breaking down, it was making room, creating space for someone new to step into the hours I'd been occupying, to fill the minutes I'd been wasting with my small, predictable life. Maybe I should be angry, maybe I should fight back, demand my existence, insist on my right to take up space in the world. But honestly, I'm tired in ways that sleep can't fix, in places that rest can't reach. And whoever is upstairs, whoever has been learning to be me, they're doing a better job of it than I ever did. They remember to water the plant on the windowsill that I always forgot about. They play music at reasonable volumes. They probably say good morning to the neighbors and actually mean it. They're becoming the version of me I never quite managed to be. So I'm writing this letter and then I'm going to leave it where they'll find it. Maybe on the kitchen counter next to the coffee I'll make for them one last time. Maybe tucked inside the book I've been reading, on the page where the protagonist finally understands what's been happening to them all along. I don't know where I'll go when I leave here, maybe nowhere. Maybe I've already gone and just haven't noticed yet. Time has gotten so unreliable that cause and effect have started trading places. Maybe I left weeks ago and this letter is just an echo, a last vibration in the air after the bell has stopped ringing. If you're reading this, if you're the one who's been walking above me, learning my footsteps and practicing my voice, thank you. Thank you for taking over when I couldn't anymore. Thank you for being me better than I ever was. The plant needs water every few days, the coffee maker sometimes sticks, and the lock on the front door catches if you don't turn the key just right. To take care of my life, I think you'll do a better job with it than I did. The clock is chiming again as I write this. 8 perfect chimes, right on time, no hesitation, no skips. It sounds relieved, like it's finally keeping time for someone who knows how to use it properly. I should probably sign this, but I'm not sure what name to use anymore. The one I was born with feels like it belongs to someone else now, and maybe it does. Maybe it always did. Story 10. The front door didn't yield to my push. My fingers curled around the handle, expecting the smooth turn and click, but it stayed unyielding. I slipped my key into the lock and it slid too easily, like it had been waiting for my return. Inside, the mirror in the hallway didn't reflect the usual echo of recent steps. I paused, waiting for the creak of floorboards under tentative weight, but only silence pressed closer. The air carried a stillness that felt deliberate, like it was closing in. As I reached for the light switch, the wall felt wrong, cooler than it should be, almost distant. My hand lingered in the uncertainty, unsure where familiarity stopped and the unknown began. That's where it starts, where I think it starts. I've been trying to piece together what happened after that moment, but my mind feels like a shattered window. The fragments reflect different pieces of light, different pieces of time, and I can't tell which ones are real anymore. I remember the sound of my own breathing. Sharp, shallow, like I'd been running, but I hadn't been running, had I? The air tasted metallic, copper pennies dissolving on my tongue, or maybe that was blood. There might have been blood. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I know my own home. I know every inch of those walls, every scuff mark on the baseboards, every loose floorboard that groans when you step on it just right. But that night was at night. The hallway felt like it belonged to someone else's house, someone else's life. I keep going back to the mirror. It was clean, too clean. The glass reflected nothing but the opposite wall, and for a moment I wondered if I was actually standing there at all. My reflection should have been immediate, automatic, but there was this delay, this hesitation, like the mirror was deciding whether or not to show me back to myself. The humming started somewhere around then, low frequency, almost below hearing. It came from inside the walls, or maybe inside my skull. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster and felt it vibrate through my bones. The sound had weight to it, substance. It made my teeth ache. There was a door at the end of the hallway. I've walked past that door thousands of times. It leads to the basement storage room where I keep old boxes and forgotten things. But that night the door was different. Light leaked from underneath it, thin and yellow like old photographs. The light pulsed in rhythm with the humming. I remember my hand on the doorknob. The metal was warm, too warm. It felt alive under my palm, like it had been waiting for my touch. When I turned it, the mechanism moved silently, as if it had been oiled recently. But I never oiled door hinges. I hate maintenance tasks like that. The basement stairs descended into darkness that the yellow light couldn't penetrate. Each step creaked under my weight, but the sound was wrong, too sharp, too immediate, like the wood was newer than it should be, or older, or made of something that wasn't wood at all. I can't remember going down those stairs, but I remember being at the bottom. The concrete floor was damp under my bare feet. When had I taken off my shoes? My socks were gone too. The dampness felt intentional, like it was seeping up through the foundation for a purpose I couldn't understand. There was someone else there, or something else. I felt their presence before I saw them, a weight in the air that didn't belong. They stood perfectly still in the corner where the yellow light couldn't reach. I knew they were watching me, but when I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. Only shadows that seemed too thick, too substantial. The smell hit me then, overheated metal and something organic, something that might have been skin left too long under hot lights. It filled my nostrils and coated the back of my throat. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but the taste was worse than the smell. I called out. I think I called out. My voice sounded strange in that space, muffled and distant like I was speaking through water. The words came back to me changed, twisted into shapes I didn't recognize. Maybe I wasn't speaking at all. Maybe I was screaming. The figure moved then, not walked, not stepped, but shifted like smoke redistributing itself. They were closer suddenly. Close enough that I should have been able to see details, features, something human to hold on to. But they remained indistinct, like my eyes couldn't quite focus on them no matter how hard I tried. They reached toward me. I felt the air move, felt the space between us compress. Their fingers were they fingers, brushed against my arm, and the touch burned cold, ice that seared like fire. The sensation traveled up my shoulder and into my chest, wrapping around my heart like wire. That's where the memory fractures completely. I have flashes after that, pieces of sensation that don't connect to anything solid, the taste of copper intensifying until it filled my mouth completely, the humming growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out my own thoughts. the yellow light brightening and dimming in patterns that almost made sense, almost formed a language I should have been able to read. I remember falling, or maybe flying. The concrete floor rushed up to meet me, but I never felt the impact. Instead, I kept falling through it, through layers of earth and stone and something else, something that wasn't quite matter but wasn't quite empty space either. There were voices then, multiple voices speaking in unison but not quite synchronized, like a choir that had forgotten how to harmonize. They spoke words I recognized individually but couldn't understand when strung together. The meaning slipped away every time I tried to grasp it. I woke up in my own bed, that much I'm certain of. The morning light streamed through familiar windows and everything appeared normal. My clothes from the previous day were folded neatly on the chair where I always put them. My shoes were lined up by the bedroom door. There was no dampness on my feet, no taste of metal in my mouth. But the basement door was locked. I found a key in my pocket that I'd never seen before, old brass worn smooth by countless hands. When I unlocked the door and looked down the stairs, everything appeared ordinary. Concrete steps, concrete floor, storage boxes stacked against the walls. No yellow light, no humming, no smell of overheated metal. The mirror in the hallway reflected me normally that morning. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection unexpectedly, there's a delay. Just a fraction of a second where the glass shows me nothing, and I wonder if I'm really there at all. I've been having dreams or memories, I can't tell the difference anymore. In them I'm back in that basement, but it's not my basement. It stretches further than it should, with corridors branching off into darkness. The figure is there too, always just at the edge of my vision, always watching. They're waiting for something, waiting for me to remember something important. The humming comes back sometimes when I'm alone in the house, faint at first, barely noticeable, but growing stronger. It seems to emanate from the walls themselves, from the foundation, from somewhere deep beneath the ground. When it happens, I press my ear to the basement door and listen. The sound is clearer there, more defined, almost like a voice trying to form words. I've started keeping notes, trying to document each fragment as it surfaces, but when I read them back, they don't make sense. The handwriting looks like mine, but the words seem to belong to someone else, someone who experienced things I can't quite remember but can't completely forget. The brass key is still in my pocket. I carry it everywhere now, though I'm not sure why. Sometimes I take it out and examine it, looking for markings or clues about its origin. The metal is always warm, regardless of the temperature around it. It feels significant, like it unlocks more than just a basement door. There are gaps in my memory from other days too. Hours that I can't account for, conversations I apparently had but don't remember. People mention seeing me in places I never went, doing things I never did. Or maybe I did do them and I just can't access those memories yet. The figure appears in my peripheral vision now, even when I'm not in the basement. A shadow that moves independently of any light source, a presence that makes the air feel thick and charged. I've stopped trying to look at them directly. Something tells me that would be a mistake, though I can't remember why. My dreams are becoming more vivid, more coherent. In them, I understand what's happening. The purpose of the yellow light, the meaning of the humming, the reason the figure watches me so intently. But when I wake, that understanding dissolves like sugar in water, leaving only the taste of something sweet and wrong. I think something is trying to come back, something that was interrupted that night in the basement, something that wasn't finished. The memories are getting stronger, more insistent. They push against the inside of my skull like pressure building behind a dam. I can feel it starting again. The air in the house is changing, becoming thicker, more deliberate. The basement door rattles sometimes when there's no wind. The humming is constant now, a low-frequency pulse that matches my heartbeat. The brass key is getting warmer.